Once you've brainstormed all the ideas of abatement levers that might be possible, as well as worked with some of your internal stakeholders to make sure that those possibilities align with your own business activities, you can think about quantifying those abatement levers and how much impact you can get from each of them. When getting into calculating emission reduction efforts, the good news is it's pretty aligned to footprinting that you've likely already done before, and you're really looking at how you can change one of the inputs for the activity data or the emission factor. In this example, we're looking at how variable frequency devices or VFDs can reduce energy and lead to both emissions savings and ultimately cost because you're using less energy. In a business as usual scenario, in the top red part of this screen, the motor is consuming 26,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, which leads to 1.43 metric tons of CO2 annually. By adding VFDs to the pump, the energy reduction in green, you can see goes down from 26,000 or 262,600 to just 600 kilowatt hours. And that's just from adding that VFT to your pump to reduce your electricity load. You'll still be using the same electricity, so nothing changes in the emissions factor as the electricity source remains the same. But since you've lowered the electricity usage, you've resulted in just 0.33 metric tons of CO2 as compared to the 1.43 metric tons. So you really can abate your emissions by reducing your activity consumption. And this also saves you greatly in costs because you're using much less electricity. This is an example of how reducing your consumption can reduce your emissions. Let's also take a minute to talk about what happens when you change the electricity source, which you can see on this example here. In this example, no changes to the equipment are made, and so the activity nets out the same. But in this example, now 50% of energy that's being consumed comes from a renewable energy resource. And since that renewable energy source does not generate emissions, the emission factor is 0. Since it's only half in the reduced emission scenario, you can see that half of the electricity consumption would be applied with that same emission factor, but the other half would have a 0 emission factor since there's no longer any emissions associated with those energy sources. Here you can see that the total emissions are cut in half from that 1.43 metric tons to 0.78. The key takeaway here is that a lower emissions alternative for energy can also result in a big impact in emission reduction. Now you can think about how that compares to what we said on the last slide, and if you use both energy efficiency measures to reduce your consumption with renewable energy resources, you can really have a huge impact on reducing your total emissions. When you look at emission reduction possibility, you also absolutely need to consider the abatement costs. Abatement costs are really what it costs to achieve the emission reductions that you need, and you can calculate your abatement cost in a few small steps. The first is to determine the total cost. First, you might want to think about CapEx. What are the total costs of purchasing and installing the solutions that you are leveraging to reduce your emission? Once you have that, you may also need to consider any operating expenses or ongoing expenses that come from maintaining the new systems that you have in place to reduce your emissions. You may also want to consider opportunity costs or potential losses in productivity or downtime from the transition period to these new resources. Once you have that all defined, you need to compare that to the current cost of the resources that you're considering changing to see the additional cost. If you're talking to your leadership teams and you show them a really big dollar value, it's sometimes helpful to give them a comparison to what it costs now. So then maybe if that number is big, doesn't seem so big compared to what you're currently spending. You also may want to consider the cost development over time and how this would evolve. Once you have all of that, you can account for indirect costs as well. If there's anything outside of the dollar value you need to spend, such as labor or resources, you may also want to consider that. It's also important that you may want to rely on cost ranges when defining your abatement costs because prices could change and things might, evolve a little bit. So having a range gives yourselves a little bit of a buffer when defining those costs. It's important to express cost clearly and simply, especially when presenting your leadership teams to your leadership teams, so they know what would be expected and required to achieve your targets. One thing to consider as well is that sometimes abatement levers don't come purely at a cost, but maybe they still have that upfront CapEx cost. If there's any potential savings from the abatement levers, that's also really important to communicate to your leadership teams as it just further builds the business case for investing in these programs.